if you do become PM and say like you were given unlimited powers, no opposition, what would be at the top of your list?
The equal treatment of women.
What does that mean?
It means lots of things. If this country did nothing else in the next 10 years but secured the equal treatment of women, from everything from more women in positions of power and boards, more women in parliament, through to bridging the gender pay gap, gender savings gap, the disproportionate burden of unpaid care which falls on women, right through to what I think is the sort of the worst example of the unfair treatment of women in society, domestic violence. If we could do nothing else but solve those problems, we would be a very rich country.
Yeah, but they're huge problems, aren't they? I mean, it's easy to say solve those issues, but in fact, we'll talk about that a bit more. I know that you've got the, you've proposed the 5-day or 10-day domestic
Paid
violence.
leave. Yep.
Yes. How is 5 days or even 10 days going to change the...
Well, it doesn't stop the violence having occurred. What it does is it means that for survivors and for people supporting survivors, it's an institutional admission from business, from the community, from government, that when bad things happen, you're not on your own as you deal with them. The problem with family violence isn't just the violence. It's then how the system injures the survivor after that. The offender quite often gets to stay in the family home and the victim has to move. Got to take the kids out of school. Invariably, you lose days at work. No, I don't think 5 days paid family violence leave changes all the problems, but it's another step towards solving it.
But wouldn't the steps be more at putting funds or resources into primary education? Like if you have a look at things like creating those awareness campaigns, which we did for Cancer Council for Slip, Slop, Slap, or the smoking, but I'm not hearing, you know, I know we talked to Our Watch and they said it's about primary, investing money in there. We
have said all of these things. I guess one of the challenges in opposition is we don't always get the chance to get our view out there, so this is fantastic to talk to you. It is about changing the attitudes towards women in society. Family violence, violence against women, stems from the unequal position of women in society. So yes, we've got to change the attitude of little boys to little girls and build respectful relationships. But it's not just that. In the workplace, you've got to have flexibility to support people who are survivors. We've got to make sure there's more frontline legal services so women don't go through the legal system on their own. The Family Law Act needs to be changed.
So will you do that? Will you pledge to do that in your first year, let's say?
I would. I've said that in the first 100 days of a Labor government I lead, we'll get all of the states and territories together, all of the police, all of the survivors, the experts. We know what to do, but what I will do is then support it with real money, because actually it's not a cost to the taxpayer solving family violence. The cost to the taxpayer is not acting on family violence.
Name 3 of your guiding principles in life.
My family. Well, my family's not a principle, but my family would be the most important thing. Working hard, being loyal, treating people fairly.
Which world leader currently in power do you most admire?
I think Obama, probably.
Why?
Still. Because he unites a country. I know there's plenty of people who don't like him, but I think for me, he speaks to the inclusive nature of what a society should be. He's a beautiful speaker. What he's done on health insurance in America, remarkable. That'll stand the test of time.
What do you think is your greatest strength?
I believe in being a person for others. I believe that we're here to help empower other people. I like people.
How significant do you think women are going to be in the coming election?
Crucial. 50% of it all. And I think the more I can talk about the equal treatment of women and unpack what it means, the idea that feminised occupations are not properly remunerated for the amount of emotional effort they have to put into their work, family violence. Quotas, putting more women in more positions of power.
Do you believe in quotas?
Yeah.
Why?
Because I groan when I hear this argument put out that the argument against having special allocation or positions for women is somehow undermining the merit principle. People who generally say that people should only get advancement by merit and therefore be against affirmative action or quotas, the people who tend to hire people like themselves. Martin Luther King repudiated the bootstraps theory in one of his famous speeches, because quite often a lot of people in America would say, well, if you just pull yourself up by your own bootstraps, that's all you need. You don't need any special programs. Now, the Reverend Martin Luther King said it more eloquently. He said, but what if you don't own a pair of boots? So in order to have equal treatment of women for positions, they've got to be starting from the same positions. And the truth of the matter is, they're frequently not. Broken periods of service because they're doing unpaid care, inequality in pay, insufficient number of mentors and role models, discrimination. So I have no hassle in supporting quotas.
What steps do you have in mind?
Asking organisations of a certain size to report how they're going in terms of where women fit in the organisations of the reporting body. If you see women predominantly around entry-level positions or mid-level positions but not at the senior partners at firms, I'm interested to see that. I think that transparency is the best disinfectant to problems. Another example is we've got a policy to promote women in science, technology, engineering and maths. So we're going to fund, and we've explained how we will do it already, 100,000 HECS debt-free places over the next 5 years in science, technology, engineering and maths. Half of them will go to women. Now that's a quota.
What do you see as the most important issue around childcare? How are you going to address it?
Cost and quality. I get that, you know, and I've raised, Chloe and I have raised kids, I get that it's expensive and that we've got a hybrid system in Australia which developed over the last number of decades, partly private sector, partly for profit, there's community, but all along the cost of childcare goes up and up and up. Now I don't view childcare as just being a baby minding facility while women go to work. It's got to have quality as well. We ask a lot of our early childhood educators, but the truth of the matter is that all of the medical research and scientific research shows that those early years of a child's development are crucial. So we need to properly fund childcare, not only to help keep downward pressure on the costs for parents, but because the education of kids, of little children, is important.
How are you going to address that?
Well, the truth of the matter is that you can't address it without putting more money into it. You've got to find more money in the budget to be able to pay for childcare. Like, you can't do it from scratch. You can't keep downward pressure on costs. You can't make sure that childcare workers are paid fairly, and you can't deliver better educational or early year education outcomes with the same amount of money. That's why we would be tougher on multinationals. That's why we will increase the tobacco excise. It's why we will cut other wasteful government programs. You tell a government by its priorities. We think it's more important to find money for childcare than to find money for negative gearing subsidies.
Okay.
I would rather not cut the corporate tax rate for multinationals and find more money for programs which build sustainable economic growth and provide relief from cost of living pressures for everyday families.
There were close to 2,000 children in detention when Labor left office, and the numbers have now been drastically reduced. Will you guarantee that you will not put children in detention?
The best way to avoid children going into detention is to discourage the people smugglers. Now I don't think I know, Labor's changed its policies. We had onshore processing for people who arrived here off boats from Indonesia, and that was leading to deadly consequences at sea. Now I wish the previous Liberal opposition had worked with us and we could have had regional resettlement a lot earlier than we did, but we do have regional resettlement. The issue now though is that the detention of people on Manus and Nauru, the waiting times for processing is blown out horrendously, so they're stuck in a sort of indefinite detention. So I'm pleased that children in detention in Australia are able to be supported in the community. But the best way to stop children going into detention and to also help the children and adults in Manus and Nauru is to have regional processing.
that's not necessarily in place. So I'm asking, will you take these children, if you are in leadership, and make sure they don't go into a detention centre?
Well, what I'm saying is that under a Labor government we will take more refugees to Australia, full stop. We will put in a children's commissioner to make sure that those who are still stuck in detention are safe. The best way to have children out of detention is to roll up one's sleeves, sit down with the nations in the region and elsewhere, and provide them long-term options out of detention. That is the best way. But what I can't do is ignore my own conscience, which says that if we just simply said we'll only worry about the people who wash up on the shores of Australia, then we know that'll lead to death and drowning. It's a really hard issue.
You've said you'll bring in marriage equality within the first 100 days of government. Is that still a firm commitment?
Yes, absolutely.
How? Will it be a conscience vote?
It will be a conscience vote, but if Labor forms a government, I believe there's a sufficient number of votes in the Parliament to then vote it up. I'm very sure of that. So I would put forward a bill for marriage equality within the first 100 days. We would have a conscience vote. I know the Labor Party side of it very well, who votes where.
So you're pretty determined that, I mean, you're pretty confident that you will get that across?
Yes, and especially because I think the government's pulled the wrong rein by saying they want to have a plebiscite. That's a very destructive debate. No one else's relationships had to be submitted to a sort of mass opinion poll. I think I don't want taxpayer money. There's some money we can save. I'd rather spend the $160 million that's being spent on the plebiscite. I'd rather spend that on some of the other issues that we've been talking about today.
Do you believe in gay marriage?
Yes. I voted for it when it came into Parliament in 2011. And I believe in it not just because I think it's about equal rights, not just because I think, it's because I think that people, if they have a loving relationship, shouldn't have that loving relationship defined by someone else. Also, the notion of the family, it's not the nuclear sort of mum, dad, a dog, a cat and two kids of the 1950s. There's many single parent households, there's many blended families. I'm in a blended family. I don't think it's right to judge one set of relationships as morally superior to another set of moral relationships. For me, what matters is children being raised in a loving household. I don't want to tell people how to live their lives. That's up for them to decide.
Your mother was a very significant figure in your life. Tell me a little bit about her.
She was born during the Depression. The family were working class, didn't have a lot of money. She was the eldest of four. They were very Catholic and very union. That sometimes led to odd arguments, I think. She was the eldest, so she had she wanted to do law, and she was bright. She was dux of her convent school, but she had to take a teacher scholarship because there wasn't enough money to pay for the education of the younger three. And so she became a teacher. She travelled the world. She taught. Mum worked full time. She did a PhD and then went back and did law school, and raising us. And she did a lot of that on her own. Eventually, the marriage broke down between Mum and Dad. But yeah, Dad was smart enough to at least let Mum be in charge of all the key decisions. What's
your greatest regret in politics?
Not getting the balance right between work and family.
So you've still got time to change that?
Well,
how are you going to do that?
When I'm home, I've got to be home in my head as well as everywhere else. You know, I don't think I'm going to be able to greatly change a lot of the time, but when I'm home, be home.
Be present.
Be in the present. And reserve some emotional space.
What's your favourite TV show?
Oh, they change each show I watch. Anything on HBO is good.
What's your guilty pleasure?
Champagne.
What makes you cry?
The thought of anything bad happening to my family.
If you could have dinner with one famous figure, dead or alive, who would it be and why?
Winston Churchill. Because I'd love to ask him, how did he find those lines of inspiration when his whole country and the whole world needed them?
Finally, what are your thoughts on Donald Trump?
Just mad as a meat axe. I don't know if he's a really slick operation and he doesn't mean any of what he spins out, But I'm not prepared to take the risk that it's all just a con job. And so I think he is right out there on the spectrum.
It's extraordinary, isn't it?
It's the personality cult in politics. Mind you, he is an act of revenge by voters who feel that politicians are just there to serve themselves. And so they sort of take the view, I think, well, we don't feel any of the current crop are serving us, so we'll give you someone who at least creates connections with us. But, you know, the truth of the matter is I don't believe Trump when he says what he says. And if he's willing to say what he says, well, then he shouldn't be in charge.
God help us. God help us. Thank you very much.